right, folks, it's 10:02 here in Raleigh. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the SECAS Third Thursday Web Forum. We host this web forum on the third Thursday of every month here at 10 a.m. Eastern Time as an opportunity to share the latest updates on the blueprint, get input and involvement from folks like y'all, and share exciting science and success stories in the world of landscape conservation in our region. As always, I'm Hillary Morris, and I work on user support and communications for the Southeast Conservation Blueprint. Here's our agenda for today. I'll start by introducing our speakers who will present for about 30 minutes or so. We'll have time at the end for Q&A and discussion, and then I'll wrap up by previewing next month's webinar and sharing some updates from your SECAS staff. As a heads up, you probably saw I am recording this web forum, and we typically do that just as an opportunity to share it with folks who inevitably wanted to attend but had some kind of conflict. So I'll put the link to the recording on the calendar event on the SECAS website within a few days. Any questions or comments before I introduce our speakers and we get started? All right, so today we'll be hearing from Dr. Patrick Bixler with the University of Texas. He is an assistant professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and Shawn Johnson, who's the managing director for the Center of Natural Resources and Environmental Policy at the University of Montana. And these folks recently completed a social network analysis for the SECAS partnership, which was recommended as one of the key next steps coming out of the 2021 SECAS Futures Report, which is a report that really assessed kind of how SECAS as a partnership provides value. And the idea is that this social network analysis would be a really helpful tool to help us increase our connections and deepen engagement with other regional forums and partners by helping SECAS understand our existing relationships and connections. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand things over to Patrick and Shawn. Y'all can take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Hillary. Some feedback there. There we go. Really great to join everyone. Seeing a lot of familiar names in the participant list there. So great to be connected with people that I've worked with in the past. Also some new names. So if I haven't met you yet, Shawn Johnson at the University of Montana, and wanted to just share a little bit about Patrick and my work history and kind of how we've been exploring landscape scale conservation and stewardship for a number of years, and then get into setting the stage for the social network analysis that we've conducted as part of this latest work. So I'm at the University of Montana, where I'm part of this small applied research center that is really more practitioner focused and really thinking about how do we do the work of landscape scale conservation and stewardship on the ground. Practical things from how do you coordinate diverse perspectives? How do you actually think across jurisdictions? How do you integrate those multiple missions and mandates that we have if we're a federal land management agency or a state agency or an NGO partner, land trust, landowner, whatever it might be. And over the years, Patrick and I have partnered on a number of different things. We worked in landscape scale efforts in Montana and Alaska, across the sagebrush biome in Southeast, Texas, and other places. And it's always fun because we bring this diversity of perspective and insight. And, you know, I'm always thinking about, what does this actually mean? What does this always add up, or what does this ultimately add up to when we're thinking at this scale? And Patrick has this curiosity and this ability to see and explore all these different parts, pieces, and connections of networks that actually support and facilitate these collaborative networked approaches to conservation and stewardship. And it's fascinating to me because intellectually, theoretically, I can understand that in order for us to scale up the work and to do it with the connectivity, with the urgency that we need, we're going to have to figure out how these networks work. And it's always a little bit of a mystery to me in terms of determining where those networks are and how they function. And that's really the impetus for this. So today's webinar is a chance to explore both what we found in the Southeast, but also this idea of networks and network governance to accomplish landscape scale goals when it comes to conservation and stewardship. Really thinking about how do we scale up beyond place-based efforts and look for larger patterns of connectedness or gaps, and then use that information to support work at different scales. So it can support and inform both that on-the-ground work that I know I'm very much interested in, and a lot of you are, but also think about those larger regional and national conversations, whether that's about the practice of landscape scale conservation or about policy or performance or data sharing or whatever it might be. It gives us insights into all those different dimensions and scales of the work. And then, as Hillary was mentioning earlier, this research question grew out of the earlier work that we were contributing to in partnership with SECAS and many of you, really thinking about governance question and that SECAS Futures report. If you're not familiar with that, it was really an exploration of function and governance, really thinking about, given SECAS's goal and membership, what could we provide in terms of insight or guidance to help it function at an even greater level of effectiveness and help it achieve success. And so that report said SECAS is doing a couple of things really well, and it's about leaning into those functions in support of the whole. And those two functions really were, first, that it serves as this forum for convening diverse voices to build shared knowledge and establish shared priorities. So really that place of convening, and the power of convening is so important when you're thinking about these different issues. You've got to build knowledge, you've got to identify those shared priorities. And second, really serving as this place of real ability and competence, I mean that in the kindest way, when it comes to bringing forward a suite of tools and data and technical support and decision support efforts that provide place-based partnerships, individual actors, agencies, and others with the information that they need to advance their on-the-ground goals and priorities. And so it's the combination of those two things that I think really make SECAS a powerful instrument across the Southeast. And then as we were concluding that report and thinking about recommendations for the future and next steps, it's maybe obvious, but was really important for us to say, well, let's draw that out and say, how can those functions really be improved over the long term in order to achieve their potential? And it's about connections. It's about, the power of convening is only as powerful as those who come together to identify those shared priorities and work to find ways to align and leverage each other's work. And similarly with the decision support tools, they're great, but it really depends on making sure that they're designed with multiple perspectives and users in mind and serve that function of helping advance decisions that are in alignment with that broader goal. So the question then is who is connected across the Southeast and for what reasons? And the research that we're going to share today gives us some insights into that question and also helps us scale that. So that's a little bit of table setting. I'm going to hand it over to Patrick next here to share the insights and results of that work. And then after that, we've got a couple of questions that we'd like to pose to you all, and certainly open it up to your questions as well. Patrick?
Yeah, thanks, Shawn. Thanks for the great introduction. Confirming my screen looks okay? My share screen?
Yep. Looks great.
Yeah, so, as Shawn mentioned, I'm going to actually walk through some of the studies we've done in the past and how that informed the current study that we did across the Southeast. And I'm kind of calling this collaborative complexity in the Southeast. And I take that some of you may be familiar with a tour to unified ecology, the Allen and Hoekstra, where they talk about these kind of different levels of ecological analysis and the need to integrate that. And I'm consistently trying to apply that framework, thinking about networks, like what is that population of organizations? Where are those connections? Where are the communities? How do we think about it across scale? And so part of what I'll share today kind of articulates that kind of background and framework. Let's see. So as I mentioned, I want to talk about some previous studies that we've done that kind of have informed what we're doing here. And one of those first studies was in the Crown of the Continent. And this is a place probably many of you are really familiar with, and certainly Shawn is, and that's how I got to know Shawn many years ago. But in the Crown of the Continent, we use network analysis to demonstrate how forums So kind of how this question of forums or partnerships play this connecting role across geographical scale, across stakeholder types, and across conservation focus areas. And so that's a figure from a publication that we have that sort of really articulates the different stakeholders across that region, across those different kind of categories, and the role that forums really played in that connection. We did some work with Amanda Sesser in the Northwest Boreal, and this was also quite a few years ago, but it was a really, really cool project. And in the Northwest Boreal, we were specifically focused at the intersection of networks, and so understanding the relationships, but also understanding the relationships and who was working with who to accomplish specific outcomes. And so we did some work where we mapped this network, but then also mapped it towards long-term landscape targets using the open science framework, kind of to identify those logic chains in mapping the networks towards those outcomes. We did some work in the sagebrush biome. This was a really large landscape, a really large region, and lots of actors. And with this study, it was pretty cool because we were looking at the relationship between multiple issues. So how actors work across, I think there was a dozen issues that we looked at, but also how those relationships and how those networks, the relationship between organizational level attributes such as collaborative capacity is what we measured in the study, and how collaborative capacity is related to that network structure. And we found some really interesting relationships, but sort of most importantly for what we're doing here is the role that bridging organizations or agencies that sit within a brokerage position, so connecting actors that aren't otherwise connected. So there was a unique relationship between these kinds of partnerships and this brokerage position and these organizational level attributes. And then we've done some work in the Texas Hill Country, and this was a cool study, and really the only one that we've done that kind of has this longitudinal framework. And so we've sampled 7 years apart in the Texas Hill Country, looking at, in part, kind of what I want to share here is how that network changed over time. And so we did measure clear changes in network size, changes in network composition, and so over time, more national NGOs and equity-oriented organizations were part of the network. And then we also saw increasing decentralization over those 7 years. And so how do these previous studies inform what we are doing in the Southeast? In a couple of ways. First of all, we thought of the starting point for this research as partnerships or as forums. And so we were targeting as our kind of unit of analysis, this partnership to begin with. Partnerships are working with individual organizations and individual agencies, and so that's demonstrated in our findings. We're considering how the blueprint or other SECAS goals shape the network structure. So we're interested in how if folks are familiar with SECAS, because not everybody that we surveyed is familiar with SECAS, and I'll talk about that in a second. But if organizations are familiar with SECAS, how influential is that to identifying partnerships in that network structure? The reverse of that is, how does the network structure shape things like utilizing the blueprint? And so we're also curious in that question. And then kind of establishing a framework for understanding change over time. I think that's an important part of what we're trying to do here. I'll go through this quickly, but here we are, we're in the SECAS. This is what Shawn mentioned. This network study came out of the SECAS Futures Report 2021 with this idea of like, we don't really know who's out there and how many folks are working together across the Southeast and where they're located. And so this is really an exploratory kind of baseline study that we undertook. In order to start to unpack this, we designed and distributed an online network survey. I'm sure many or most of you received that survey in probably 17 reminder emails from me. It is important to note that we only sent this to one point of contact within an organization, and that gets a little methodologically sort of fuzzy because obviously, especially with large organizations, you have multiple people with multiple sort of individual networks. But the goal of this is to really take the organization as the unit of analysis and try to understand those interorganizational relationships. With federal agencies, we tried our best to be as lower scale as possible. And so we try to emphasize that in the way the survey is distributed. And so that can go down to geographical, space, or programmatic kind of units. And so that's our goal with the sampling. And so we initiated the study with a population of organizations that were aggregated external to SECAS. And so we sent them the survey. They responded back. And part of that response was, hey, here's the partners I work with. When we got new partners, we cross-checked that list of partners with who we sent the survey to, and any new partners that were named also got an invitation to complete the survey. And so through this, we're trying to snowball this sample to really, like, who do you work with, but the person you work with, who do they work with, and then who do they work with? And through that process, can we start to identify organizations that may be non-traditional or really local in scale, and sort of how do we really snowball and understand the population of organizations that are out there. In total, we invited 303 people to take the survey, and we had a 45% response rate. Right, and organizations were the unit of analysis. And so who's out there? And this is kind of what we found in total. So from the 303 responses, we identified 560 organizations that were out there. As you can see, a lot of those folks are in the Southeast, but lots of people doing work in the Southeast work with folks outside of the region. And so those are reported there as well. There were some pretty clearly identified hotspots of sort of activity, or if you think of population density or organizational density, some hotspots of organizations in North Carolina, Virginia, Texas, Florida, Georgia. And then it's not exhaustive, and we know that, and you can kind of tell that by looking at some of the states. And so some of the states, such as Arkansas, had a pretty low density, and we know that there are folks working in Arkansas, but I don't know if it's the level of analysis, kind of the scale of analysis that we're asking, but our process here didn't pick up as much activity in some states as in others. And so there's the network structure. And so we think about, well, how are these organizations connected or related to each other, working together across these different issues? And so of those, was it 560 organizations? We had 822 total ties, on average 1.5 connections. 47% of those identified were nonprofit organizations. And federal agencies on average had the most network ties. So if we think about kind of the average mean connections, the average connections by organization type, federal agencies kind of are the most active types of organizations in the network. 25% of those that are identified in the 560 were partnerships or collaboratives. So again, that was kind of our starting point. It was only sending the survey to partnerships, collaboratives. And at the end of the snowballing process, about 25% of those organizations were identified as partnerships and collaboratives. Of the 560, we only identified sort of within these working relationships, right, within this network, 9 tribal entities and 13 private sector entities. And so again, we know that there are more out there. And it may be an artifact of the data collection process, and or it may be that we're not actually engaging or working with tribal entities in the way that we want to, in the way that we think we are at a high level. So we also asked some questions around specific kind of engagement and familiarity with SECAS. And so again, remember that this was not a SECAS listserv that it was distributed to. It was a kind of an external sample that we put together. And so when asked if folks are familiar with SECAS, about 45%, 47% of those surveyed are familiar with SECAS. And so, that leaves about half or more than half that weren't familiar with SECAS. We can break this down kind of by state, and there's kind of some interesting patterns, and also by organization type. I think for both of those, just to kind of note that there are some smaller sample sizes by state. I mentioned that with reference to Arkansas. So kind of take this as maybe a signal, but not statistically robust, how some of these patterns may play out in real life. But for example, Louisiana, Maryland, West Virginia, 100% of folks who took the survey from those states were familiar with SECAS. Less folks in Kentucky, Virginia, and Florida were familiar with SECAS. Federal agencies and local agencies, yes, familiar with SECAS. Nonprofit, tribal, and others were less familiar with SECAS. So I think as we think about, how do you activate this network? How do we design strategies for further engagement? Again, I think this information is kind of a signal of where some strong points are and signal where some opportunities are. When we ask how folks engage with SECAS, by and large, the conservation blueprint was, it sort of is the mechanism that people are engaging with SECAS, followed by the regional forum, goal tracking report, specific projects, etc. People are largely satisfied with the conservation blueprint, but maybe maybe some room for improvement, because the majority of those were satisfied and not very satisfied. I don't know how. That's obviously a subjective measure, but by and large, folks are satisfied with the SECAS blueprint. And then there's kind of some questions that we asked around, are you interested in engaging with SECAS? And when we ask that, are you interested question, we see folks are both interested in the blueprint, but also very much the regional forum, decision support hub, goal tracking report. And so I think that's pretty interesting how people are engaging with SECAS, the blueprint, how people are interested in engaging with SECAS, and this idea of the regional forum definitely shows up more prominently in that interested in question. We asked folks to rank issues, like how important are specific issues to your organization. The top rated issue in importance was species conservation, followed by habitat connectivity, ecosystem services. You can see that distribution there. And then these next questions were kind of asked with sort of the functioning of SECAS in mind. Do you have existing resources that are useful on these issues? And where could resources be useful, again, on these issues? And so existing resources are useful for habitat connectivity, species conservation, climate resilience. And then places where resources could be useful, you see some other things or a slightly different order in that space. And predominantly the resources that people are reporting could be useful are related to equity and access. So even though on the far left there, equity and access as an important issue was ranked pretty low, there's an acknowledgement sort of among those surveyed that resources related to equity and access could be useful. I think a side note to this important issue question is that folks were also able to select other and then kind of write in what that other issue was. And so the other category in terms of issue importance was rated the highest above species conservation. And so there's kind of something unique in there that the projects that folks are working on with their networks are really important. And I think in many cases when they wrote in their question, it clearly would fit into one of these kind of broader categories. But I think there's probably something we can think through related to how do we create an umbrella where folks' other projects sort of feed into the broader SECAS framework and sort of blueprint, et cetera. So then we have these issues, right? So we just rated these issues in order of importance. We can also look at the individual networks related to these issues. And I think I'm happy, after the webinar, we're happy to share the slides. We can also share a companion. It's an output HTML file that has all of these separate issue networks and allows you to kind of zoom in, see see who those organizations are, sort of who they're connected to, and kind of allows a little bit of interactivity in that file. And so we're happy to share that. So this slide right here summarizes those issue networks. And so you can see the number of organizations, so which of these networks are most active, the number of edges per organization. So there's some network statistics related to those issue networks. And then that's followed by those average importance scores. Resources are useful, resources could be useful. And so it's kind of summarizes all the information of the last handful of slides. And what we see is that species conservation is the most important issue. It's also the most active network. Most active networks are issues that are associated with SECAS, the SECAS conservation blueprint, which is great, right? Because remember, not everybody in this network is familiar with SECAS. And so folks are working on these issues, the very active networks on things that SECAS does currently provide resources and provides them well based on who we heard from. So pretty kind of an interesting point, this number 3, that for equity and access and cultural resources, that tribal organizations on average have more average connections. So even though there are very few of them in the overall network, tribal entities, tribal organizations, when it comes to these issues of equity and access and cultural resources, that's where they are very highly connected. So people are really leaning on tribal entities in those spaces, on those issues. And then I think there's an opportunity for partnerships or other actors to grow issue areas or kind of weave conflict issues together. And we can talk a little bit more about that here in a second. So if I just look at the partnerships, remember about 25% of the overall sample were partnerships or sort of forums partnerships. And if we just look at the partnerships or forums, that's where they're geographically located. In the network on the right, they're in the stars, those little stars, and it's kind of hard to see, but the stars in there are partnerships and forums. And I think this gets back to sort of weaving issues and weaving across geographies, that there are a lot of partnerships and forums across the landscape that are pretty distributed pretty evenly across the Southeast. And so how do we think about using those partnerships and forums as kind of the hubs to better weave across issue areas, to better weave across geography, and better connect those partnerships and forums kind of to the SECAS platform. And then finally, this is a really kind of cool depiction of the network. And so here the squares are referencing those actors that are familiar with SECAS. And so what we see here are that, the folks in the network that are familiar with SECAS play really central roles in this network. The size of the square or the circle is relative to the number of connections that they have. So the bigger the square, the bigger the circle, the higher centrality they are in the network, more central they are in the network. And so you can see here that that the people who are familiar with SECAS are also really central to this overall network. And so I think that's right, that this community right here is in a really important place to reach a really broad range of stakeholders across the region. And that's my last slide. Thanks for the time. This is a really fun project. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and maybe we can see some folks and open it up for questions and I think maybe more importantly, the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for that awesome presentation. Shawn, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just was going to jump in for a second, Hillary, and then we can open it up. But wanted to just say thanks, Patrick. It's always great to hear you present on our work, and the way that you help us see insights into those complex relationships and maps is really useful and important. And just a couple of things. Every time I look at the data or hear you talk about it, I see a couple of different things. This other category that you talked about in terms of where are people really seeing the important issues across the Southeast. In thinking about that, it's not, in my mind, just that we didn't capture maybe that level of importance around whether it was habitat connectivity or species conservation or climate resilience as single categories, but so many of these landscape scale efforts end up pursuing these multi-benefit outcomes. And so if your order of priority is maybe not necessarily a single issue or conservation action, it really was about how different landscape scale partnerships were creating these really almost bespoke approaches for their landscape type, given the context, the politics, the environment in which they're working. And so I think that's actually a hallmark of these landscape scale efforts, is that they're really customized, and yet we want to provide some insight that's generalizable across the region and across the partnership level. A couple of other things were just the role of federal agencies. I'm not sure you highlighted this too much, but they were the organizational type that had the highest number of ties or connections within this network, according to the data. And to me, that was a little bit surprising in a way. I always think about who are those entities across a landscape or across sectors that tend to be those connectors. And sometimes my mind goes more towards either the university space, certainly some bias there, or towards nonprofit organizations. But it's a reminder that all of us play a really critical role in weaving the connections that facilitate networked approaches to landscape scale conservation and stewardship, that we might have different roles within that network or within those partnerships, but that the connections themselves are really critical. And so we need to think about how are all of our different organizational types connected to and embedded within these networks in order to bring their strengths, their functions forward with the greatest effectiveness possible. The other thing I'll call out was just this high-level observation that as broad and pervasive and as high-functioning as SECAS is, it's only on the radar of about half of the people that we were in contact with through this survey. And so there's so much space to think about, well, what does that mean for being able to share information and support different efforts and make sure they're connected, both in terms of what they're trying to do, but also what access to what information they have. And so this question of forum is really an interesting one, I think, to continue to think about. And one of the ways we were hoping to explore that, and I think have some insight through this analysis, was that we were really looking at our initial targeted list of respondents as those that were already involved in some sort of landscape scale partnership. So not really looking at that individual organizational level or node, but thinking about who's already engaged in some sort of conversation within their landscape. And if we could think about connecting those different forums, that might have unique impact on the types of conversations we're trying to advance. So just wanted to name that. And then we want to open it up to questions here or observations or insights. And as we do that, just a question for you guys. We are nearing the end of this project, and I think we have a lot of really interesting data and insights and graphics to share in terms of reporting it out. We're also really interested in making these findings as meaningful and relevant as possible. And so if there's something that stood out to you that you're like, I can really see how this information would support or inform what I'm doing, love to hear how you see that connection and what kind of insight it's giving you and how it can support your work. Or if there's something else that you're like, I'm really not sure yet, but I see a potential pathway to use this information to support my work, I'd love to just invite a conversation around what that could look like, and any follow-ups would certainly be welcome as well, that we could connect offline by email or by phone after today. We're trying to get this all wrapped up by the end of June, so we've got a little bit of time, and I really just want this to be as connected to your work and supportive of your work as possible. So with that, we'll just open it up and take any questions or comments.
Yeah, we have plenty of time. So to Shawn's point, if anybody has things from the presentation that leapt out at them as potential future applications that you'd like them to emphasize as they're sort of tying up loose ends on this project, that is very much fair game. or if you have questions, please feel free to jump in. You can just take yourself off mute or raise your hand if you really want to be civilized about it, but there aren't that many of us on the phone, so you're welcome to jump in. I might kick us off with some questions from the chat. I had one clarifying question. You showed a chart or a graph that referenced local agencies, and I wonder if you could maybe share an example of what a local agency would be. Is that like a city county government? When it was saying that local agency familiarity was fairly high.
Yeah, I think those would be, I can try to look it up after I give this answer and give you some specific examples, but those would be local. Usually they're kind of city, county agencies or this. And I will say that, what 140 people took the survey, and we asked this question on the survey, but for all 560 people in the network, we manually kind of looked them up, found out who they were, and coded these attributes. And so we kind of created a criteria, like who would fall into this local agency category. So yeah, kind of city, county agencies. I can come back here in a second with some like actual examples.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think this kind of leads into Louise's question, another one of our user support team members, just looking at that breakdown by state. Maryland isn't even in the SECAS geography. So certainly there are, connections there that are great to cultivate, but it's not necessarily surprising that they wouldn't have as much use of the blueprint or familiarity with what they do because they're not in the CF geography. But whereas in Florida, we have worked a lot with the state agency. And so I think Louise was just kind of wondering, is this going back to kind of who from each agency took the survey, or do you have any, I don't know if we could maybe look back at that state graph. So yeah, feel free to elaborate, Louise.
Oh, and I was having a side conversation too with somebody, and it just struck me, and I'm also coming from user support, and because Hillary we all track where we work, and so I have kind of a mental model of that geographic distribution. And so because I have that in my head, I was looking at some of the results and I was just like, oh, those are just different. But we're doing different levels of engagement there. But in Florida particularly, we worked with the Florida LCC, Florida CLIP, the universities, and so many different folks across the state agency. I think actually Best Eyes did used to work for Florida too, and who's now come on board with Science Apps and was SECAS and stuff. And so you can see it here, but I guess it was that graph that showed who was aware, and just seeing that Maryland showed up as 100% aware by state. But it was just interesting for me to see that, like, oh, so many people in Florida haven't heard of us, but we worked, or familiar with SECAS, but we worked so much in Florida across sectors. But Maryland is where we've never really had a use case, is like, yes, we have heard of SECAS.
Yeah, I think probably for the report, we need to include like sample sizes or some sort of bounds of uncertainty. Maryland, it may have only been one respondent in Maryland, and they took the survey because they clearly work with somebody from SECAS. So I think, again, taking some of this with a grain of salt. In Florida, I'm guessing we had a good sample size, and maybe a lot of partners that were identified in this kind of second round of snowball or first round, right? Because these weren't specifically SECAS. The sample that we generated was external to, anything to do with SECAS. So, Florida is probably a pretty good sample size. I can think of a number of partnerships that were really highly connected, a number of nodes. But within that, we don't know if they were, we do know, but these graphs don't show who took those. Were they federal agencies? Were they state agencies? So this sort of like the crosstab, which we could actually do of state and organization type, that information's not showing here.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I was gonna
like to respond. Oh, sorry, Shawn, please jump in.
Oh,
no, that's okay. And then I do see a hand up there. It was just, Louise, appreciate the question. I think in part of your chat response, you're getting at the source of that. It goes back to who took the survey. And just to reiterate where we started from with a little bit more specificity, we really were looking at existing landscape scale partnerships, and we took that information from different existing data sources. So a few years ago, the Network for Landscape Conservation national North American scale network had flown a survey where they were just trying to basically take an inventory of all these different networks and partnerships across the country, across North America. So that was one data source. There was another competitive grant program that we had access to the applicant pool for, that was another source of data for these existing landscape scale partnerships that were focused on different conservation and stewardship objectives. And then there was, I think, one other data source. And then we kind of tested that with some people who were familiar with landscape scale efforts across the Southeast. We're really trying to deliberately not start from a SECAS database, because one of the questions was this one of familiarity with SECAS and wanting to see how that permeated existing networks and different conversation spaces. But certainly there were gaps. And I think, as Patrick noted, some of those gaps were geographic. State of Arkansas stood out, or organizational type, or different governance structure. So certainly some gaps, and yet some really, I think, important insights for us as we think about the functional roles that networks play in supporting outcomes and the benefits that we want to see on our landscapes for habitat, conservation, connectivity, but also those social and economic outputs and outcomes as well. All right, let's go to the next question. Hillary, I don't know. Do you want to moderate, or do you want me to?
It's all good. We can tag team. But yeah, Farron, please feel free to speak up. You've been waiting patiently.
That's fine. Hi, everyone. So I'm Farron Walter. I'm based at the Chesapeake Bay Field Office in Annapolis, Maryland. I work with science applications. One of the things I do is manage the Chesapeake Wild Grant Program and that collaborative process and network. And so one of the things I was thought about, and this question came up, is obviously we work closely with Maryland partners, and we talk about SECAS and we talk about blueprints as we talk about our own blueprints. And so how cool would it be maybe someday to do a network analysis looking at cross-programmatic support? So maybe that Maryland person who answered that question heard about it in a wild meeting. I mean, who knows, right? Like, it's just one of those things in those conversations that we are also having very similar landscape scale conversations. And a large chunk of our watershed overlaps with SECAS. And as we think about building the different blueprints and how we scale these things up. So, yeah, I'd love to explore this further. And it would be cool to see, how they heard about it. And with that, I could say that cross-programmatic leveraging would be fun to explore.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks, Farron. Appreciate that insight and your work. And we didn't get into it too much today, but one of the things that Patrick shared as part of that HTML output file that he referenced is kind of the sub-networks by a different thematic or issue focus area. And it helps us think not just about cross-programmatic areas, but across those multi-benefit outcomes that I think a lot of people are seeking. So you could look at what is the network of individuals or organizations that are focused on species habitat or connectivity issues versus equity and access, and where are their potential insights that help us stitch together more robust and connected networks within and across those different issue areas. So it's pretty cool stuff to dig into and think about.
I see Jocelyn's hand next, if you'd like to speak up.
Hi, yes. Hey, everybody, I'm Jocelyn Lucas. I'm the Working Lands for Wildlife Aquatics Coordinator. And I have been most recently working on, this is a really relevant talk today, and I'm really excited to see this work because I think it's such a big need and we're all aware of it. But we're working on a collaboration support tool right now for the Southeast for this very purpose, to facilitate better landscape scale partnerships across the Southeast and the range of the aquatic framework that we're developing. And we have been utilizing some of the SECAS data, and I would love to explore the opportunity to utilize maybe some of this data from the study, or which layers would be great to use as context in the tool itself as we continue developing that, and we're having some partner meetings coming up soon. So yeah, I would love to talk more about that at some point. But thanks.
That's awesome, Jocelyn. Yeah, we hope that this is interesting and relevant to the different conversations you're having. And if there are ways that we can help support those conversations or provide data or information or jump on a call beforehand, glad to do that.
Shawn and Patrick, it does sound like there's a fair amount of interest in follow-up. You might consider like dropping your contact information in the chat at some point before we wrap up, just in case folks do want to reach out. Anybody else? We've got probably another 8 or so minutes for questions or for the type of feedback that Shawn was talking about and ideas on how they could present this information to be most applicable for your work in the report.
We're hoping, I think, Jocelyn, to sort of to your point, but then just for this community, we're hoping to kind of build something similar to what I'm going to I can share via this HTML, where it's a little interactive. We're hoping to build like a web-based platform that integrates these actors across space, but also has the ability to overlay some GIS layers. And so that would be, I mean, I guess the hope would be that it's a kind of a SECAS resource, and sort of it's both a directory of folks that may go out of date really quickly. We know that, and this was a year old already, and so some of these kind of contacts and organizations may not be there. But then also just kind of be that kind of what you were referencing, right? Can we overlay some of this ecological information? Where are those hotspots, and in those hotspots, what are they working on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we should talk too, because I want to make sure that I'm not duplicating any efforts that you're already, undertaking, and make it, each tool unique, or maybe just leverage each other's resources, just like we're trying to do here. But yeah, this is great information. Thank you.
Cool.
Thanks, y'all. This has been great discussion. I'm going to pause one more time and see if anybody else would like to chime in with a question or comment in the chat, or verbally is fine too. Emily, jump in.
Hi, Emily Grandstaff. I'm also SECAS staff, and I'm not a social scientist, but and I'm super interested in these types of analysis, and just kind of curious, what were some of your? I know you did a great job summarizing, the results, but were there things that that you were some of your biggest take homes, or maybe some of your biggest surprises that you got from doing this? Just, I'm just kind of curious from a social scientist perspective.
Great question. Either of you is welcome to answer that.
That's a great Shawn question. He's a really great, he's just really good at pulling from the data to the big picture.
That sounds like such a setup, but thanks, Patrick, and thanks for the question, Emily. I think a couple of things really stood out to me. One, Patrick highlighted in the presentation, which is when people are looking for help in these networks, they're often looking to places where they're just not finding that in other places, but no, it's a really important and relevant conversation and topic. And the equity and access piece is something that we're seeing across different landscape scale conservation initiatives, where people understand that in order to make meaningful progress on conservation issues, we really need to be thinking about our social connections and whose voices are at the table and how they're included. And it's not a traditional strength of conservation or land management activity. And so how do we think differently about that and integrate insights and information and knowledge into those conversations? So that really did stand out to me, and it felt really important to try to not just name that need, but to somehow think about addressing it as part of the broader landscape conservation stewardship community. I think the other thing that stood out to me is that, and this might be pretty obvious, but it's always an important insight whenever I work with Patrick on these different efforts is that there's a dynamism in this work. And, Patrick was just referencing the fact that the connections, or if we were to use this information as a directory, is pretty immediately out of date because of people changing positions or, the focus of the work changes. And yet that dynamism isn't a bug, it's a feature of the work. And so how do we really lean into the ever-changing adaptive nature of this work in a way that's intentional and isn't a barrier to doing the work well? And that means, I think, really thinking about action networks as opposed to static organizational structures that support this work. And thinking about it in that frame is really hard, but I think will help us achieve success at scale that we can't do at the individual ground level. So I'll stop there. But Patrick, anything else you wanted to highlight? And then I see we have got another hand up. Hey, Ruo.
Yeah, maybe just real quick. And I thought, I just think it's just maybe simply the real opportunity here in both that, perhaps not surprising, but that there's really important issues overlay really well with the SECAS blueprint. And then there's this neat connecting that to the interested in a regional forum piece, connected to the way that folks who are familiar with SECAS are already really well connected. And I think part of maybe part of what we've learned from past studies, maybe this was written in the text, but I don't think I said it out loud, is that I think a lot of kind of different evidence is pointing to this idea that it's not more connections. More connections are probably burdensome and really hard to maintain. It's more strategic connections. And so I think as we think about who's out across the landscape, how those folks are connected to SECAS, how can we be strategic and anticipatory about how we build new connections and sort of, as Shawn likes to say, weave the network. And I think there's a real opportunity here. Just really cool. It's neat to sort of overlay the blueprint and the sort of ecological hotspots with what we can now see with this kind of social capacity, governance capacity. Rua?
Yeah, Rua, take it away.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say, other than this is really awesome. Great summaries and very actionable, which is really exciting. I think that points to a lot of good things that, like, okay, little tweaks or things we can work on, things we can prioritize a little more. And they just I think the take homes, what made me feel good is that a lot of the take homes that y'all were saying were like, oh, those were my big take homes too. I didn't miss anything big. The equity one I thought was interesting and how it stood out, and that being a component of so many of the organizations, but the sort of gap filling piece. And the other thing that struck me about the equity one, if I was interpreting it right, is the organizations interested in equity were very disconnected as a community compared to everything else. Every little category was like, okay, these folks are pretty much working together, but there was interest, but there's an interest in doing more. And when you showed that social network, it's like, wow, this is a very not connected network of people working on equity and access. And so that also pointed to another, being that regional glue, connecting great work and integrating it across those partnerships. Like that, to me, just looks like, as we get through, it's like, oh, the cultural and the access equity, there was a lot of big gaps and a lot of islands that I think SECAS could, especially because we already have some equity components and cultural components we work on as part of the blueprint and the partnership. It seemed like a nice opportunity to be like, oh, maybe we should strengthen those even more through the things we do as a regional forum and through the blueprint. So it was interesting seeing that in a more data-driven approach. So yeah, kudos on everything, all the pieces, all the spots, but that one in particular was one that's like, oh yeah, this just hits on all the different cylinders of that network.
Yeah, it's a great observation with those really tiny graphs. I don't know how you pulled that out, but I don't know I don't know if my screen's still sharing. I think it is, but I just expanded that equity and access, and you're exactly right. It is a very decentralized, disconnected, lots of small clusters that are maybe geographically isolated. We're not sure by this graph, but sort of doing this on their own, right? So tremendous opportunity to connect those folks. And you can see right there some partnerships sort of connect this work together and provide resources. Yeah, I think that's
which is, to me, this is like very ripe for SECAS integration, because it's not like you have everyone's disconnected. It's like, oh, you actually have a lot of connections and existing partnerships that do these things. It's just the partnerships aren't connected and these little networks aren't connected. So it's like, oh, that's actually a little bit more manageable to integrate across existing efforts than if you have a lot of kind of scattered. That's a bigger haul. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah.
I was just saying in the chat, sounds like a need for a backbone organization to me. Help bring together all those different islands. Well, for time, I'm going to cut off Q&A here, but thank you all so much for this fantastic and really rich conversation and this very thought-provoking presentation. This has been awesome. Love to see it when everybody's jumping in and chatting. I'm just going to wrap up with a quick preview of next month's Web Forum, so you all know what to expect. If you tune back in, we're going to be hearing from Michelle Moorman, who's with Inventory and Monitoring with the National Wildlife Refuge System in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And she's been doing a lot of work through surface elevation table monitoring on coastal national wildlife refuges, and with the USGS on some remote sensed approaches to measure the unvegetated vegetated ratio. That's looking at kind of the ratio of open water and sediment to vegetation in coastal wetlands and how that tends to predict a marsh's vulnerability to conversion to open water through threats like coastal development, erosion, sea level rise. And she's also been doing a lot of work actually talking with refuge managers in the Southeast to kind of understand what they're observing on the ground. So I think this is going to be a really interesting talk that's going to bring together on-the-ground observations, long-term monitoring at specific sites, and kind of remote sensed approaches and how they all work together to paint a picture of how our coastal wetlands are changing and how we can better adapt through things like the RAD framework, where we can resist change, accept change, and direct change. So definitely looking forward to this. That is May 16th, same time, same connection information as today. And then a couple of super fast updates from your SECAS staff in the last 2 minutes. I've just updated the numbers on blueprint use and involvement. This is something that, as Louise mentioned, we do track who we're working with and where. And I'm really happy to report that so far the Southeast Blueprint has helped bring in over $190 million in conservation funding to help protect and restore over 300,000 acres. And through some really ambitious programs like the America the Beautiful Challenge, Inflation Reduction Act funding, bipartisan infrastructure law funding, there's been a pretty dramatic increase in the amount of conservation on the ground and the amount of money that's been informed by the blueprint in the last year. And we're seeing the number of people and unique organizations using the blueprint who are participating in developing the blueprint continue to grow, and we're really excited about that. And maybe kind of works with the social network analysis theme of the people and who they represent that are participating in SECAS. And I'm going to let Rua have the last word here, talking a little bit about our progress so far on indicators for the next blueprint update.
So we've updated a bunch of things related to new land cover and information, including an access indicator, urban park size, and equitable access. So we've been working on, there's new land cover, so we're keeping all the data fresh. We're likely to be able to update the imperiled aquatic species data with new information. So fingers crossed, we should be good on that. Expanding coverage for amphibian and reptile areas. We made some significant updates to Gulf coral and hard bottom. And then we have 2 new indicators, one that cover the entire Southeast, one related to landscape condition, and one related to Southeast grasslands and savannas. So we're making some good progress. We're basically, our spatial data deadline is mid-May. So we're getting pretty close to having the indicators for this year wrapped up. But yeah, we have been working on all of the things in those different categories we were just looking at, including the equity and cultural. And also, which is not listed here because it won't be in the 2024, we're making really good updates on things related to river cane, working closely with a number of different folks. So that's another exciting one that, you know, we knew was going to come, not going to come this year, but part of a larger, bigger discussion range-wide.
Thanks, Rhea. And for those of you who are used to participating in workshops, we're playing with a slightly adjusted timeline this year, where we're going to try to do workshops in the fall once we actually have all the indicator data online, so that people can better see in those workshops why things are a priority in the blueprint. That was some feedback coming out of our last round of workshops. So if you like to come to workshops, never fear, we are having them just a little bit later than we have in the past. And as always, I like to end on this slide on how to get involved in SECAS. We're at time, so I'm just going to go ahead and and say have an awesome rest of your day and an awesome weekend. And thank you so much again, Shawn and Patrick. Sounds like there's a lot of interest in future collaborations, so definitely feel free to reach out to them. Enjoy the rest of your day, y'all. Thanks again for tuning in, and thanks again, Shawn and Patrick.